Why Eichman couldn't laugh. 15 one-minute parables. 1. The transparent man. Henri Bergson spoke about the comedy of correction. This is perhaps the harsh laughter of a God who knows us in our entirety and before whom we are ridiculous and transparent. Kierkegaard, in Fear and Trembling, says, "A man in a glass cage is not so constrained as is each human in his transparency before God." I can't help thinking of Adolf Eichmann in his glass cage and in his opaqueness, a transparency that failed to reveal much at all except a lack of depth, further descending layers of transparency. Camus once defined the absurd as, and I quote, "seeing a man talking on the phone behind a glass partition." Yesterday, anyone walking past my house in Hampstead and looking through the window would have recognized the absurdity of a man in a grim-faced struggle with his computer, trying to finish a paper on laughter. 2. The unfunniness of jokes. Joking is a grim subject. Freud's treatise on wit is one of the least amusing books I have ever read. Indeed, none of the illustrative jokes seem very funny at all. Some are downright baffling. John Carey, the English critic, in an introduction to Freud's The Joke and its relationship to the unconscious, describes an old German joke as, I quote, "one of the few jokes collected by Freud that still seems funny to today's reader." But that joke isn't funny either. The implication that readers of the past were in convulsions about any of the other jokes strikes me as unlikely. This problem, of course, has been well documented over the years. Collections of jokes are strictly for the comically challenged. As one writer put it, reviewing a Canadian anthology of humour, "Give me an 800-page extravaganza by a Guatemalan magical realist. Give me a book on German accountancy." Meanwhile, Bergson's rapidly multiplying taxonomies of comedy made me feel as if I would never laugh again. 3. Goering considers it unsportsmanlike to kill children. Goering, who considered it unsportsmanlike to kill children, said in an interview before his suicide that one or two of his fellow defendants at Nuremberg were not normal men. The implication is frightening. We immediately remember the stories of Tojo tending his garden or footage of Hitler playing with his nieces. Anticipating the themes of Jonathan Glazer's recent Oscar-winning film, The Zone of Interest, George Steiner wondered about the man who can play Schubert and Bach in the evening and go to his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning. This is our modern mystery. For Giorgio Agamben, the full horror of the mass killing is expressed in a football game played in one of the camps between the Sonderkommando and the SS each Sunday. For Agamben, we are always in the midst of this soccer match, averting our eyes from some horror as we play. This is the seduction and the normality of evil. 4. Hess looks unwell. One of Goering's fellow defendants, and surely one of the abnormal individuals he refers to as Rudolf Hess. In photos of the trial, Hess has the faraway look of a man who's either seen too much or understood too little. He gazes blankly, perhaps pitilessly. A rough beast indeed. The question of his sanity was a funny question to ask in the midst of a trial involving men who were said to be responsible for murdering Europe's Jewish population. There is a joke. Hess flew to Scotland in order to sue for a peace with the United Kingdom. He is captured by a Scottish laird who asks him if he is indeed the madman. "No, I'm his deputy," replied Hess. Later, mapping Hess's apparent madness onto a bureaucratic penitentiary logic, Hess becomes the only prisoner in Spandau in Berlin, guarded by the four great powers on a rotating basis. Mad, mutually assured detention. When the Americans and the Soviets exchange keys, they each send out their tallest soldier in a mini arms race. The soldiers get taller and taller on each side. Eventually, the game ends when the Soviets appear with their smallest soldier. This marks, perhaps, the end of the Cold War. 5. Eichmann's humour. Eichmann became known via Arendt for his thoughtlessness. He just couldn't place himself in another person's shoes. Arendt too has been accused of a failure of imagination. She perhaps also couldn't or was not willing to place herself in the shoes of the Jewish leadership in the 1940s. But she understood something about Eichmann. His banality was extraordinary. Another interrogator, this time a psychiatrist, was asked whether Eichmann was normal, more normal than I am, having interviewed him. This is amusing, but not quite right. Eichmann himself would not have understood the joke. As Avner Less, one of his interrogators, said, I was especially struck by his complete lack of humour. Eichmann hardly represents what it means to be human, but he shared something about humanity, or with humanity. Humanity, with a capital H, also lacks a sense of humour. Ramon Poincaré, the French president, announced at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 that humanity can place confidence in you because you are not among those who have outraged the rights of humanity. But humanity here included the Belgians, French, and British, each of whom were by this time responsible for at least 3 centuries of violent, certainly racially inflected empire. Though the Imperial War Cabinet on November the 20th, 1917 began at noon, there was a lot to get through. The main line of business was the disposition of the Kaiser. What were the representatives of humanity going to do about this outlaw after the war? But first there were some minor matters to take care of. Lloyd George. There are 2 or 3 questions we're not clear about. Palestine, East Africa, questions of that kind. We have not quite settled in our minds what sort of government we will set up in Mesopotamia. It was ever thus. Here are the representatives of civilization just prior to elaborating the idea that aggressive war could be a crime against humanity, reordering their imperial outposts, themselves, as Justice Powell remarked at Tokyo, the result of 3 centuries of aggressive war. I went back to the National Archive documentation from this meeting. How did the Imperial War Cabinet get from its own imperial consolidations and restructurings to the enemy's crimes against humanity? After all, they each seem to be grounded on precisely the same combination of non-consensual territorial acquisition and mass violations of human rights. Was there a hint of self-consciousness? What was the hinge? Well, between the surprisingly cursory discussion of Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, and the lengthier debate about the Kaiser, there is one short announcement. A telegram is read out from the Association of Universal Loyal Negroes of Panama. It reads, Negroes throughout Panama send congratulations on your victory, and in return for services rendered throughout the world in fighting, beg that their heritage wrested from Germany in Africa may become a national home with self-government. This is passed over in silence, and the discussion moves on to the Kaiser's terrible crime of making war on Europe and the shock this delivered to the conscience of mankind. 7. Mankind receives another shock. For Arendt, a show trial is a spectacle with prearranged results, or the obliteration through compulsive staging of the irreducible risk of acquittal. The point of the trial is the trial itself, its ramifications, its warnings, its effluxions of terror. George Orwell understood this. When I was 16, we were told by my high school that we would have to write a major essay on a literary figure. I chose Orwell because it was 1980 and everyone was very excited about the prospects for 1984. The NME had predicted that by that time the levels of surveillance would be much more widespread than in the novel of the same name. I went to the English master and told him I wanted to write on irony in the novels of George Orwell. Which novels? He asked archly. The minor novels, I replied, building irony upon irony. So I began wading through Keep the Aspidistra Flying and Coming Up for Air. There's a reason, it turned out, why these books are largely unread. Mrs. Parsons lives with her 2 little demonic children at Victory Mansions. Her drains are blocked, as they often are, and she calls Winston Smith down to help unblock the sink. The 2 children torment Winston, calling him a Eurasian spy, threatening to vaporize him, and shouting Goldstein as he leaves the flat. Mrs. Parsons is apologetic. The children are furious, she explains, because she failed to take them to the hanging. And I quote, some Eurasian prisoners guilty of war crimes were to be hanged that evening. This happened once a month and was a popular spectacle. War crimes trials, not depoliticized programs of management, but wild-eyed theaters of revenge, human rights with a vengeance. As one of the observers of the Moscow show trials eerily put it, these are dramas of subjective innocence and objective guilt. The show trials themselves continued into the 1950s, most famously in Prague, where the purpose was not to determine guilt or innocence, nor even to remove political opponents, but rather to create them. The proceedings there were initially conceived as trials of fairly low-level apparatchiks. Under pressure from Moscow, President Gottwald, perhaps still wearing his disappeared Comrade Clements hat from the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, found a high-level defendant, Otto Sling, a district party secretary. Under torture, Sling implicated Rudolf Slansky, the general secretary of the Czech Communist Party, in a fantastic and implausible conspiracy. Finally, the Soviet advisors had a defendant of sufficient seniority. The Czechs were initially shocked and bemused. What about the evidence? One Soviet legal advisor, soon to be himself purged, said, we have been sent here to stage trials, not to check whether the charges are true. 8. Adolf Eichman receives a shocking book. Mankind is, of course, shocked by many different things at different times. In Jerusalem, Adolf Eichmann seemed unshockable. His thoughtlessness, indeed, was his most remarkable quality. Arendt, again. The longer one listened to him, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected to his inability to think. He was genuinely incapable of uttering a single sentence that was not a cliché. He seemed curiously affectless, in other words. At one point, he is handed some novels to read. One of them is Lolita. After 2 days, Eichmann returned the novel, visibly indignant. That is quite an unwholesome book, he tells the guard. Hayden White implots the Shoah. A famous World Court judge once told me that humor and genocide were an impossible, perhaps blasphemous combination. Richard Evans, arguing against postmodernism, wanted us to accept that there are limits to the ways in which one could implot the Holocaust. In Saul Friedlander's Probing the Limits of Representation, he states, Auschwitz was indeed inherently a tragedy and cannot be seen either as a comedy or farce. Life is Beautiful is a comedy set in a concentration camp. Hayden White said, every field is constituted by what it forbids its practitioners to do. White, roundly criticized for claiming that history could be plotted in multiple ways, would have appreciated the animating spirit behind this book. The question, to take our field more or less seriously. In White Noise, Don DeLillo's airborne toxic event novel, the protagonist, Professor Gladney, has established a Center for Hitler Studies. A junior visiting faculty member is deeply impressed by this initiative. He makes a lengthy sycophantic speech about how Gladney has more or less invented Hitler studies. He goes on to say at a meeting, Professor Gladney, no one can so much mention Hitler without a metaphorical glance in your direction. It's what I want to do with Elvis. 10. Tojo loses his head. Shimokawa, the Japanese propagandist, was eventually declared insane and unfit to stand trial by William Webb, the presiding judge at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Okawa had slapped Tojo over the head in a piece of slapstick comedy. But how comic is this? How long did Tojo swing in the air before dying? Maybe like von Ribbentrop for several minutes, but Okawa is a key figure in the history of ironic disjunctions. Prior to his removal from the trial, Okawa argued that this trial is not the realization of justice, but the continuation of war. His brilliantly Clausewitzian but ultimately unacceptable formula anticipates later critiques of the trial and of international criminal justice itself. Okawa asserted that Japan's imperial war was not an aggressive war at all, but an act of preemptive self-defense. This argument was rejected by the tribunal, of course. The Soviets in particular, later to preemptively attack Czechoslovakia, declared the doctrine to be disreputable. Meanwhile, half a century later, Okawa's insanity was to become President Bush's foreign policy. Okawa, a Shakespearean fool, a madman, speaking obscure sense. 11. Eichman loses his head. In 1998, just around the time of the execution by lethal injection of Carla Faye Tucker in Texas, her appeal for clemency having been turned down by a certain Governor Bush, Martin Amis, Saul Bellow, and several others were having dinner and discussing the case. Almost everyone was in disagreement that the death penalty was an outrage, not just in this case, but in every case. There was a classic liberal consensus at the dinner table, punctuated but only by the silence of Bellow. Amos turns to Bellow, astonished. "I can't believe it, Saul. You don't agree with this, do you?" "Well, how could the author of Herzog or the Dean's December believe in capital punishment?" Bellow's response consisted of 2 words: Adolf Eichmann. 12. How many Americans does it take to commit genocide? As Eichmann was being tried in 1960, Stanley Milgram was curious about whether there would have been sufficient people in the United States prepared to guard and run the concentration camps. He set up a famous experiment in which average citizens were given fairly non-coercive instructions to torture fake subjects. His conclusion: there would have been more than enough willing torturers and guards in New Haven alone. 13. Raskolnikov finds it amusing. In Crime and Punishment, when Raskolnikov confesses his double murder, he asks Sonia, "You think it's funny?" Before answering his own question, "Well, yes, the funny part about it, Sonia, is that that's exactly how it was." Sonia did not think it at all funny. 14. Erdogan finds it libelous. Brecht once said, "The greatest political criminals must be exposed, and exposed especially to laughter." Peter Cook opened his new club, The Establishment, in Soho, and said he had consciously imitated those wonderful Berlin cabarets which had done so much to stop the rise of Hitler and prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. But maybe we should keep Cook in mind while trying to side with Brecht. Laughter can surely be dangerous. One might laugh too hard at a joke of Stalin's, not hard enough at a quip of Mugabe's. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter, and when he cried, the little children died in the streets. Auden epitaph for a tyrant. What is humanity's law? A satirist under arrest for laughing at another country's head of state? This is the law of laughter, humanity's extra-jurisdictional law of laughter. 15, and finally, Sonia finds it blasphemous. Ironic laughter arises, as it were, organically from the gap between our hopes and the abridgment of these hopes, or in the abyss between illusion and experience. To think in terms of comic law might be then at worst simply counter-hubristic or frivolous. At best it might mark a tentative step towards a better or more supple language with which law might gesture at murderous violence. Carlo Nino, radical evil. Our vocabulary for moral blame soon runs out when we want to condemn the murder of 6 million persons or the torture of children. To say that these acts are wrong sounds like a kind of irony. Not all laughter is ironic, though. Another form of laughter might be understood as less intellectual or reflective. It's the rebellious, instinctive laughter of a world in which some lives and deaths are more sacred than others. A laughter through tears, anxiety, hysteria. This is the laughter we all experience, perhaps, when we have narrowly avoided danger. In Crime and Punishment again, Raskolnikov talks about being tempted by the devil and by his own double murder and by the comedy of it. Funny, isn't it? He asks. Don't laugh, blasphemer, exclaims Sonia.